Hey, everybody. So, the first round of the Democratic debates is over. The dust has settled. Public opinion has crystallized to some extent. A few polls have been taken. So, it's time for me to offer my own takeaways from the first two Democratic debates. And it may not surprise you to find that my takes on these debates differ somewhat from the conventional wisdom. Now, my top line conclusions aren't all that different. I thought that the greatest beneficiary of the debates was Liz Warren. I thought that her presentation was crisp, it was clear, she was quick out of the blocks, talking about things like health care and income inequality. She may have receded in her participation a little bit later in the debate, but she was comfortable in her own skin, did what she needed to do, and was basically a smart and comfortable presence on stage. I liked her a lot. Now, the biggest loser, again, not surprisingly, was Joe Biden. Now, on that point, virtually everybody agrees. But it's once you actually get into the details of Biden's skirmish with Kamala Harris that I begin to part company with the conventional wisdom. I thought that Kamala Harris's critique of Biden was wrong-headed, was bogus, was misguided, and was somewhat demagogic in nature. In the week after Biden initially made his statement about having worked with segregationists to achieve legislative ends, in that week, Kamala Harris variously claimed that he had coddled segregationists, that he had praised segregationists, and that he had elevated segregationists. Well, nothing could be further from the truth. Biden's point was a rather simple and uncontroversial one, which is that sometimes in order to get legislation completed, you have to work with people whose point of view you find abhorrent. That's the nature of the game. You have to remember that the Southern segregationists, James Eastland, Herman Talmadge, John Stennis, these were some of the longest standing, most powerful people within the Senate. You had to play ball with him if you were going to get anything done. And if you have some objection to Joe Biden working with segregationists, you must really be upset by Lyndon Johnson, because he constantly had to have segregationists on the phone, mollifying them, pacifying them, threatening them at times, bringing them along to get the Civil Rights Act passed in 1964 and the Voting Rights Act passed in 1965. These were people with chairmanships. Herman Talmadge was in the Senate for 35 years. James Eastland was in the Senate for 35 years. John Stennis was in the Senate for 41 years. And furthermore, it's important to remember that the threshold for ending a filibuster back in those days was not 60 as it is today. It was 67. You had to have 2/3 of the Senate with you in order to get important legislation passed. So you obviously had to deal with these individuals. And if you found something objectionable about Joe Biden and Lyndon Johnson working with segregationists, you must also hate the Watergate Committee, because they placed as chairman of the Watergate Committee Sam Ervin, senator from North Carolina, who was also a segregationist. Perhaps not as rabid, not as outspoken as others, but nonetheless, he was one of the people that authored the Southern Manifesto after the Brown versus Board of Education ruling, in which Southerners pledged that they would do everything they could to put forth massive resistance to integration. Sam Ervin, who, as we all know, became a folk hero for the manner in which he conducted the Watergate hearing. Now, I know this. Kamala Harris knows it, but she doesn't care because she was simply interested in scoring points. And if she were listening to me right now, she would say, well, I wasn't really focused on that part of what he said. I happen to know that he was a great opponent of busing. And that's what disturbed me. Well, busing is a very complicated topic, and let's talk about busing a little bit. As a lifelong progressive, I was an ardent supporter of busing back in the 60s, 70s, and beyond as a way of redressing age-old discrimination in public schools. I was a big supporter of busing. But when I look at busing from the vantage point of 2019, busing as a means of ending segregation was a flop. Joe Biden was fundamentally correct when he said busing will probably do more to impede civil rights than it will to advance civil rights. Busing flopped, and the reason it flopped was white flight. It flopped because there was an increased interest on the part of the white community in sending kids to private schools beyond the reach of any busing policy. It flopped because as time went by, the courts progressively whittled away the role of busing as a means of ending segregation. And importantly, busing flopped because it never really achieved overwhelming support, even within the black community. That's right. If you think about the black community, you have to think about the unease, the uncertainty, the ambivalence of black mothers and fathers sending their kids to white schools miles away, schools that they know nothing about, have no control over, and can't be sure that their children will be welcomed in those schools. Of course there was ambivalence in the black community about busing. Even if you could promise somebody your kid will be safe, no harm will come to your kid, that doesn't necessarily mean that your child will have a positive experience in those schools. So now in 2019, what do we find when we look at the public school system? We find significantly segregated schools. Not the sort of deliberate de jure segregation of yesteryear, but de facto segregation that's the result of residential living patterns where blacks and Hispanics tend to live in these communities over here and whites tend to live in these communities over here, and it leads to significantly segregated schools. So not to belabor this point, the topic of busing is far more complex than Kamala Harris would have led us to believe. And her tweet of her being bused in the Berkeley school system, it's a cute anecdote, but it's basically meaningless. Now let me say a few words about Joe Biden, because listening to me, you might come to the conclusion, wow, he's really interested in trying to rehabilitate poor Joe Biden. No, not at all. I believe that Joe Biden is a terrible candidate. I feel that he is not up to par in this election cycle. I think that he neither merits the nomination, nor do I believe he has any chance of getting the nomination. And let me just say a few words why. In my view, Joe Biden's campaign has been a grease fire from the beginning. I was dismayed when I saw that he was calling up Anita Hill 1 week before announcing his candidacy to make amends with her. Really? You're calling up somebody 28 years after the Clarence Thomas hearings to make amends? If you really wanted to make amends with Anita Hill, call her up 20 years ago, 8 years ago, 5 years ago. But don't wait until the eve of your campaign announcement to do it. That's ridiculous. Then he went on The View television show, and they said, do you owe Anita Hill an apology? Joe Biden wasn't ready to answer that question. He stumbled all over himself and finally managed to say, well, she was mistreated, but I didn't mistreat her. Joe, you were the chairman of the Judiciary Committee at the time. What are you talking about? A few weeks later, the issue of the Hyde Amendment comes up. The question of whether the federal government will fund abortions for low-income women. And Joe Biden adopts 3 different positions on the Hyde Amendment in a span of 48 hours. Not ready for prime time. Then he's asked about the 94 crime bill. Now, if you were a supporter of the 94 crime bill, there's some ways that you can try to justify your vote. You can say, we made significant strides in community policing, and we put 100,000 new policemen out on the streets where they can best do their jobs. We had significant money and initiatives that would protected women from domestic violence. There were some very positive pieces in that legislation. What you can't say in trying to defend yourself is that it did not contribute to mass incarceration. Of course, it contributed to mass incarceration. Bill Clinton has acknowledged that. Everybody's acknowledged that, except Joe Biden, who's still stuck on, no, I don't think it added to mass incarceration. Not ready for prime time. And finally, in trying to put together a climate change proposal, Joe Biden's campaign had all the look of a 13-year-old who was late on his book report and who simply cribbed stuff from the internet to try to complete the assignment. That's what they did. They just lifted passages from academic documents and called that their climate proposal. That's terrible. Joe Biden is like a football player who retired 3 years ago, and he's come back and he thinks he can play. But the game has changed, the coach has changed, the players have changed, the rules have changed, and he's 2 steps slow. Joe Biden is not a first-string player anymore. Now, lest I sound like this is going to be a completely negative rant of a blog, let's go to my second takeaway, which is which people handled the debates well? Which people helped themselves in the debates? Well, Julian Castro certainly did. At first, I was a little worried that he was just going to be a one-note Johnny talking about immigration. But I've listened, subsequent to the debate, I've listened to Castro talk about any number of topics, and he's eloquent, he's thoughtful, he's interesting, beyond what I realized prior to the debates. I believe he really did help himself. I also believe that Michael Bennet helped himself. I thought he did a good job talking about his own version of Medicare for All, which offers a little bit more choice than, say, Bernie's proposal does. And I thought he was a compelling figure during the debates. Now, unfortunately, when the next round of debates takes place in July, the same low bar will exist for who can get in the debate. So we may have the same 10 and 10 that we had before. But the people I'd like not to see in the next round are Marianne Williamson, Bill de Blasio, he can go. I thought Kirsten Gillibrand did not distinguish herself. Her strategy during the debate seemed to be butt in at any moment and just keep talking until and unless somebody cuts off your microphone. That was not pleasant to watch. Tulsi Gabbard is gone. I don't need to see Hickenlooper anymore. And I would certainly prefer it if Beto went and began a race for the Senate in Texas rather than competing for the presidential nomination, because he's not going to get the presidential nomination. Cory Booker may survive through September when the criteria for getting in the debates will get more stringent. He may still be around. But come September, it would be a very welcome sight to see a debate with 5, 6, maybe 7 people rather than 20. Now, my third takeaway from the debate centers around the question of who screwed the pooch, who embarrassed him or herself, who really fell flat in a way that was shocking. Well, the answer to that question is folks with names like Todd, Guthrie, Holt, Diaz-Balart, Maddow, all fell flat. And the reason that they fell flat is this is the network, NBC, that is the network of Tim Russert, Tom Brokaw, John Chancellor, David Brinkley. These 5 individuals conducted a 2-hour debate and did not see fit to ask one question about the issue that overhangs every political action in this election cycle, that of impeachment. Impeachment is the cloud that hovers above everything. Not only should impeachment have been addressed in the Thursday debate, it was not. It should have been the first question asked. You know how fond they are of asking people, raise your hand if you. Well, there should have been the first question asked should have been, raise your hand if you think Nancy Pelosi should initiate an impeachment inquiry immediately. Some people would have put their hands up. Some people would have kept them down. Joe Biden would have had his hand halfway up where you weren't sure whether he was asking to be acknowledged or raising his hand to answer the question, as he did multiple times through that debate. It was a question that had to be asked. I wanted to hear people's takes on the urgency that they felt. And you might ask, that's right. These are some of the best and brightest from NBC and MSNBC. How could they have neglected to ask any questions about impeachment? Well, I'll tell you how it happened. What has happened, I believe, is that Donald Trump has managed to bully this process so successfully that he has turned Nancy Pelosi into a weak-kneed enabler of Trump. Nancy Pelosi is Donald Trump's best friend right now because they both have this unholy alliance where they're hoping for the same thing. He's hoping to run out the clock so that people like Don McGahn's deputy, Annie Donaldson, Corey Lewandowski, Mike Flynn, that he's hoping that none of those people will ever take the stand in a committee hearing before a national audience to speak the truth about the ways that he tried to obstruct this investigation. Nancy Pelosi is trying to run out the clock because for reasons that I don't understand, she doesn't feel the urgency and the importance of launching an impeachment inquiry. Now, I would submit to you if there were an ongoing impeachment inquiry, we might not have any more witnesses than we've seen already. The matter would still be in the courts. But there would be a different level of urgency. The American electorate would be watching more closely because the word impeachment has a certain magnitude, a certain gravity about it that makes people sit up and take notice. We would be in a different landscape now if we had a different Speaker of the House. And I originally supported Nancy Pelosi, but I didn't realize that this is what we were going to get. So shame on the questioners. There should never be a debate again in which we go for 2 hours without any discussion of the impeachment issue whatsoever. And my hope for all of us is that sooner rather than later, we'll have smaller sized debates, smarter debates, and a good, solid nominee will start to emerge. I'm Jeff Rowan. Thanks for watching.